Hello, I'm Nola Jones, Executive Director of Victims of Choice, and I want to talk to you today about abortion recovery. Our training tapes are broken down into segments. In our first segment, we will be talking about the parent-child relationship. As we begin to think about that relationship, I want you to think of it as something that's unique in its beginning and development. It's very complex and interwoven, different than any other relationship that we have on earth. You think about the relationship with your spouse, how you met that person, how that relationship developed and continued. You think about your best friend, the one who will stick with you even when the gossip gets thick. How you met that friend and how your relationship developed. It is different, far different from the parent-child relationship. You see, that relationship begins with the first thoughts. I think I might be pregnant. And then there's the confirmation with the doctor. Yes, you are definitely going to have a child. And we go home and we call everybody and we tell everybody, it's real, I'm going to have this baby. And so the beginning is unique, it's complex. And as this relationship develops, it begins to become interwoven. The first bodily signs, the first touch, kick. And then now through ultrasound, we began to see our child as young as 8 weeks on in the womb. And we see the little kicks and movement and the heart beating. And we began to get in touch with this person inside of us. And later on, as we began to feel the baby turn over. And then there's the delivery and the nursing. This is such a personal relationship between the parent and child that is unique in all aspects of it. Abortion abruptly arrests that relationship. Abortion is promoted as an eraser, something that can take us back to pre-parenthood, something that can make us the unparent. We have the uncola, the unparent generation for this undesirable, untimely pregnancy. So the question is, can abortion erase the parent-child relationship? No. The answer clearly is that it does not. Abortion cannot take you back to pre-parenthood. Because once the abortion occurs, it then creates an ambivalence, a void in the parent's life. You see, parents are parents forever, whether they're adults, minors, male, females, married or unmarried. And abortion creates a vacancy. That parent always has a part of that child's life. That abortion, that child becomes a part of the parent's history. We then move to denial. Denial plays an awfully big role as we think about abortion and recovery. Let's first talk about the basis of denial. Denial serves as a major mechanism in each one of us, which actually is not a bad mechanism. It serves to protect us from overwhelming anxieties, from the surfacings of threat, loss, or danger. And it is good and very helpful in management during a crisis situation. Some examples of this would be emergency room workers, firefighters, policemen. They come across a tragedy, a crisis, and they're able to manage through it by the process of denial, by blocking and preventing the surfacing of the reality of the situation. Perhaps a child of yours was hit by a car. Rather than accepting the reality and the dangers and the threat and the loss of that child, through the process of denial, you would be able to go and call 911, put a blanket over your child, stay there with them, maybe begin to offer first aid. Where denial becomes dysfunctional is when it is employed, when it becomes chronic, when it becomes long-term in the process of life. We're going to be talking about a woman maintaining denial in two areas. Abortion denial begins by saying that pregnancy does not equal child. So the first abortion denial is that pregnancy equals child. Denial of the child's existence now. The second phase or element of abortion denial is the abortion procedure or the abortion surgery itself. I'd like to focus right now on the first abortion denial, and that is the child's existence. We know that with an untimely, undesirable pregnancy, that there are certain elements that contribute to this particular denial, that the pregnancy does somehow equate to a child. I'd like to share 3 of those areas with you. The first one is with our society. See, our society contributes to the fact that pregnancy does not equal baby. First, let's look at the role of the government. We have political leaders that endorse abortion. Many of our countries and states pay for abortion through taxes. We have our own inactions. Our society, even our church society, says that pregnancy does not equal baby. You see, if we really believed, as even Christian community, if we really believed that abortion was killing children, that it was tearing them apart piece by piece, that it was decapitating their heads, we would probably not be sitting here watching this video. If you were in church this Sunday and the government marched through the doors into the church nursery and began shooting down all the 2- and 3-year-olds, probably someone in the sanctuary would react to that. They wouldn't continue holding church or singing praise songs. What they would do is go in and maybe push the guards down, maybe block some of the bullets with their own bodies. They would begin to scream, run out of the churches, tell the media what is happening. But you see, our own inactions say that pregnancy does not equal baby. Probably worse than that is a voice called the Christian community under Coalition for Religious Rights. This coalition is compiled of hundreds of churches throughout the United States that claim as the Christian voice that abortion is a woman's right, a woman's choice. And this year, during Cherry Blossom year, 1989, what they did was they had little buttons that they tagged on their sweaters and shirts that showed families carrying little balloons, holding hands of children, pulling wagons, and on these buttons they stated, pro-God, pro-family, pro-choice. The religious community for abortion. The second element that contributes that pregnancy does not equal baby are the pressures that surround a crisis pregnancy. Many of you working in alternative centers know that when a woman is faced with family pressure, career pressure, that these begin to mount up and become more of a focus to her than the baby or the child. She may say something like, if I don't have this abortion, my boyfriend will leave me. My parents will throw me out of the house. I couldn't possibly have a child now because I just got this career promotion, or I'm getting my master's degree, I'm finishing high school. Whatever her particular pressures are, they seem to rise up and become magnified over the life of the child or even the acceptance of its existence. The third element that I'd like to talk about, the element that I believe is the primary contributor, that is the propaganda that's put out by the abortion providers. Something that I've done over recent years is to ask in a debate the abortion provider to answer this question. Would you please tell me scientifically when you believe that life begins? I'd like to share some of those answers with you. Most of the providers believe that life begins the moment that birth is given to a wanted baby. Another answer that I got from a woman who was a registered witch, a registered lesbian, and she was director of 4 abortion clinics in Northern California. When she answered the question, scientifically, when does life begin? She stated, life begins the moment a woman wants to become pregnant. Another answer I received from scientists is that life begins the moment birth is given to a wanted child and the child has been declared free of any serious illnesses or defects. You see, abortion providers believe that the child is merely potential life. They call it a P.O.C, product of conception. the contents of the uterus will be removed, is what women are told when they are seeking abortion counseling by abortion providers. These providers primarily contribute to the denial of the child's existence. We then move on to denial employed. And this is where we move into defining abortion trauma and post-abortion syndrome. So as a woman has an abortion, the procedure, and we'll talk about that as we move further on into the segments, she then steps out of the clinic, maintaining that her pregnancy had nothing to do with the baby now, and that the abortion, the trauma, the surgery itself, never occurred. And denying both of these elements then takes her in to a dysfunctional state. So let's talk about abortion denial employed. The woman goes, just like the literature says, goes out of the clinic, totally forgetting, thinking it was a 10-minute procedure, and that her life is going to be exactly the same as it was before the pregnancy and before the abortion. She begins to impact this stress, this trauma, these emotions into her life. She refuses to deal with the reality that she was pregnant, that she was a mother, that she went through a painful experience. And by impacting this trauma into her life, she then becomes dysfunctional, and she begins to be a different person than what she was prior to this experience. This is what is called post-traumatic stress disorder, and when it's tied to abortion, post-abortion syndrome. I'd like to talk about stressors. The word stressor is the first definition that you'll need to get under your belt as a counselor. A stressor is an event outside the normal human range of experience. For example, rape is a stressor. That's an event outside the normal human range of experience. The Vietnam War is normally related to as a stressor. What we believe is that the intentional destruction of one's unborn child is beyond the normal human range of experience, and that it indeed is a stressor. In your manual, you were given a copy of the diagnostic criteria that was developed by Dr. Vincent Rue, which clearly shows how the intentional destruction of one's unborn child does indeed become a post-traumatic stress disorder. I'd like to go ahead and close this segment and pick up next time with the characteristics of denial. Welcome to segment 2. This segment we will be talking about dysfunctions and the characteristics of denial, and we will be following up segment 1 and bringing that to a close, and we'll be talking about post-abortion foundation. Most often, women do not see presenting problems and dysfunctions like we do from the outside. We women who have had abortions more than likely will blame other people for our dysfunctions and problems. For example, rather than to examine ourselves why we've had 3 or 4 marriages, we will always blame it on the men. Rather than why we've had 7 jobs or a new job each month, we will blame it on our employer. We do not connect today's presenting problems with an abortion that happened 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. I'd like to summarize all of that by a quote from Dr. J. Willard Worden from Harvard Medical School. He states, "When I worked at the University Health Service, I counseled many women who had had abortions, and frequently they did not recognize that the unresolved grief from a previous abortion laid behind what was currently troubling them. Abortion is one of those unspeakable losses that people would rather forget." You see, we do what the literature says. We go on with our life as though nothing had ever happened. I guess a parallel story or something that you could picture in your mind to understand this concept perhaps better is the alcoholic who waits until everyone leaves the house. He goes out and he buys his bottles and hides them. He sees himself pour the alcohol, drinks it. He sees every day how his children become dysfunctional, how we don't talk about feelings in this house. Everything revolves around father, so we don't disturb him. His wife says to him every night, "Honey, you're sick. Look at you. You're an alcoholic. You drink all the time. We need to get you some help." And he looks at her and says, "It's your fault. You just nag me too much. If you would quit nagging me, I would quit drinking." Or perhaps, "I'm just a social drinker. I don't have a drinking problem." So is the woman who's had an abortion, totally unaware of her root problem. And so her life becomes dysfunctional. Let's talk a little bit about the characteristics of denial. First, note that there are different degrees, different depths. These 3 degrees are mild, moderate, and severe. There are 6 different types. These types we'll cover one by one. The first one is occluded denial. Occluded denial is the most pathological, unhealthy, abnormal. Occluded denial is no awareness, total repression that the pregnancy and or the abortion even occurred in this individual's life. A woman could have 2 or 3 abortions, and yet when you asked her, "Have you ever had an abortion?" she would honestly tell you, "No, I've never had a crisis pregnancy or an abortion." Often occluded denial looks like this. A client comes into you with 2 abortions, and she's hurting from them. She wants to be counseled through them. And after about 6 hours into the counseling, your client just kind of falls and says, "I just remembered I've had 3 abortions in between this one and this one." Or occluded denial can be that the woman doesn't remember having the abortion and she still thinks that she's pregnant. This is called a phantom pregnancy. The woman maintains her weight, she is still sick, maybe she goes out and buys a Cabbage Patch doll. So she forgets about the abortion, that's in repression, but yet she remembers that she was pregnant. The second type of denial I'd like to talk about is periodic denial. I believe that periodic denial occurs during the decision-making and the abortion process. Periodic denial refers to time invested. It's usually a short duration with no other dysfunctions or any type of outward signs that any type of denial is going on in this woman's life. Therefore, she's able to walk into the clinic. She's denying that pregnancy is a baby, that abortion is going to take the life of her child. And through the pain and through the process of abortion, she then can go through and walk out of the clinic. I believe periodic denial then moves into our third type, obliteration denial. Obliteration denial is different in that it's an awareness, a conscious effort to avoid dealing with the pregnancy and the abortion procedure. This person, fully aware of the fact that they've had a pregnancy and abortion, says, "That's it, it's all over with, I'm not going to deal with it." And they act out or avoid dealing with anything that has to do with the pregnancy or the abortion. They bury it within themselves. They impact it into their life. The fourth is compensatory denial. Compensatory denial creates both a distraction and a new emotional investment. This particular denial takes on an acting out, an action, a rush mode. It would look like a woman would say, I have 3 jobs, I go to school full time, I'm the president of the Glee Club, I begin maybe taking drugs and alcohol, hanging around with people that I never used to hang around with, becomes a workaholic, sexual hyperactivity. All of this fast-paced motion then creates something for me to invest my emotions in. It distracts me. Also, this type of denial can cause atonement children. An atonement child is a follow-up pregnancy and abortion, another pregnancy and the resulting in an abortion. The next type of denial, number 5, is segmented denial. This is undoubtedly most employed We see this quite common, particularly in the feminist movement. Segmented denial is the separation from the mind to the emotion. It looks like this. Yes, I've had 3 abortions, and frankly, I'm glad that I chose to have abortion, and I'm happy that choice was there for me. And of course, the more women who stand up and say, I've suffered from abortion, we're seeing now more women coming forward claiming that abortion was a good thing for them. Segmented denial is confusing to people because they hear someone state that they've had an abortion and it was a good thing. Women can do that because this denial blocks off feelings. This person does not feel the loss, does not feel the grief. They become emotionally numb. They are numb to their maternal feelings. They are numb to being feminine. They begin to take on a masculine type of role. And we, again, see this in the feminist movement. They're unable to feel the pain. The last type of denial is purposive denial. Purposive denial allows a woman to say, I've had an abortion and I feel guilty and I'm very shameful about the whole thing. Unfortunately, she becomes withdrawn and becomes isolated and blocks the intrusive, deep pain that needs to be relinquished. I believe it is the women sitting in our churches that are in this state of mind who hear us on Sanctity of Human Life Sunday or Respect Life Sunday talk about abortion. They acknowledge their own abortions, they feel guilty about it, but they're so embarrassed and so ashamed and withdraw from the Christian community, withdraw from any leadership, and they begin to hurt and begin to hold this deep, deep pain within themselves. I'd like to move in to end this segment into the dysfunctions on how they look to us. We said there were 3 degrees, we said there were 6 different types of denial, and now we're moving into dysfunctions. Now there are pages and pages of dysfunctions. When I say dysfunctions, I'm talking anything from eating disorders to sleeping disorders. And I'd like to kind of explain to you what some of these dysfunctions are. We'll only cover a few here in the video. And how or why these dysfunctions are a part of a woman's life. What caused it during the abortion or the decision-making process. And then how that looks to us on the outside. Again, women do not recognize their own dysfunctions and they do not connect them to their abortion. So let's take the first one. I have never met any individual who's participated in abortion and has walked away from it without hating themselves. We have a self-hatred. You see, women are created to bear life, to give life. We are created to have unconditional love. You see, Dad picks up the kids and he spanks them for doing something wrong. Why Mom says, but he didn't eat yet and he hasn't had enough sleep today. And so we have this unconditional love. Women are nurturers. We're petters. You know, I often tell people across, North America, the petting zoos are not filled with children. They are filled with moms, and we're all in there petting the rabbits and the goats, and the children are outside playing. We are the people who fuss with hair, and we are the people who nurture. And with this, we also protect life. If a burglar came into your home, what would the husband do? He would go to the burglar. What would the mother do? She would go to protect the children, even if it meant sacrificing her own life. An abortion is all of this turned inside out. You see, she now takes the child in to have it killed for her own convenience, or maybe for the convenience of her parents or the boyfriend. She participates in the death of her own child. And what woman could do that without psychological impairment? Now, I guarantee you, a client will not come to you and say, yes, I had an abortion 10 years ago and I hate myself and therefore I'm living with self-victimizing behavior. So what that looks like to you as a friend or a counselor is you're going to see a person reject compliments. You're going to see perhaps a defensive attitude. You are going to see a woman who maybe has a job that victimizes her. She's a cocktail waitress. She's a secretary who's constantly badgered and abused. Maybe she lives with a husband who physically abuses her. And you ask her, why do you stay there? Well, I don't know. She accepts punishment as a normal means of life. Another item I'd like to talk about, who we are on the inside, is we're very untrusting and suspicious. This is because during the time of crisis, a point where we were in shock, we were not processing, we trusted our lives and the lives of our children to another individual, mostly the medical community. And they told us that if we would just give them so much money, that they would take care of all of our problems, and we believed them. And because of this exploitation now, we no longer have a trust factor. You will not have a client come to you and say, hello, I've had an abortion and I'm very untrusting. So what you will see on the outside, you will see a person who is hard to build a rapport with, someone who is not so intimate as other friends that you have. Quite often, women who have had abortions are very down on men. And the reverse is true. Men are very down on women. You will have people who are very suspicious. Well, what do you think about abortion? You will see a attitude of, what do you get out of this? The next one that I'd like to cover is isolation. Inside, we are very secret and withdrawn. And I believe this begins the moment the woman begins to say to herself, in her isolation, I can't believe that I'm pregnant. And we do what the literature says. It says confidentiality. You don't have to tell your parents. You don't have to tell your boyfriend or husband. Confidential. And so we go to the clinic confidentially. No support. After the abortion, again, everything is kept inward. After the abortion is over, there's the isolation, the quietness of the room. All of this begins, this withdrawn personality that seems to come with abortion. Now this can have one of two reactions to the woman. She can maintain that secrecy, become withdrawn from her family. Jeannie just doesn't participate with the family like she used to. She just stays in her room all the time. When Grandma and Grandpa come over, she doesn't even come down to see them, and they used to be her favorite people. Or it can be just the opposite. People can't stand to be alone. My husband is always leaving me alone. They have teddy bears and stuffed animals that they use in their car because they cannot even be in their car alone. They go out to places so that they don't have to be alone. Again, a person will not see these dysfunctions, and if they do, they will not connect it with their abortion. Just to kind of wrap it up, I'd like to do one more dysfunction that I believe is often common in the clients that I've seen, and that is we are controllers. Inside, we are controllers. This is because abortion is such an out-of-control trauma. For those who have had first trimester abortions, the woman will sit in a waiting room and often be given Valium, and she's called by a person she has never seen before. And she walks into a room where she's never been before. And she's told, take off all your clothes. Get up on the table. Scoot down. Put your legs up. And in walks a man, generally a man, that she has never seen before. And he begins to insert into her body objects that cause pain. And she begins to think, I want to get down, I want to get out of here. But she's not able to. She is forced, emotionally forced, to stay there. And it begins an out-of-control situation. The suction machine is turned on, and as she begins to feel the pulling and the tugging and the pain, she wants it to stop, but she can't. For late-term abortions, the salt is injected, and she begins to feel her baby thrash inside of her. And she says, I'm sorry, I didn't know you were alive. And she wants to stop, but she can't. It's out of control. And so you see, we will never be out of control again. And The outside of that, what it looks like to others, is anything from controlling the kitchen, to controlling the monopoly game, to controlling the job. It can even be something that appears to be very helpful and good and a strong characteristic, like maybe she's a career person, she's the supervisor at her job, and yet she is totally in control of her children, the checkbook, every decision that's made, and begins to feel out of control if any decisions are taken or made outside of her authority. So this again can become very dysfunctional. I'd like to encourage you to read the training manual and Dr. Vincent Rue's book, as well as the other books that are listed in the library section in your training manual, to get a fuller picture of these type of dysfunctions and how they look on the outside. Thank you. Welcome to segment 3. We're going to go ahead and begin learning about the goals of the program. We'll begin with goal number 1, covering education and abortion connectors. You know, I have a hotline in my office that goes directly to Heaven's office, and God called me up one day and he said, "Nola, I have a little story to tell you about Adam when I first created him." And I said, "Oh, go ahead, you know, I'm not really doing a whole lot now." And so God said, when I first created Adam, I put him into an atmosphere that was a little frightening because he had all these living creatures running about him. He had things flying over the air and things crawling out of the water and swimming in the water and swinging from trees and on mountaintops. And it kind of flipped him out because he didn't know what these things were. He didn't understand their behaviors. He was just suddenly in a place where all these living creatures were running about. And so I told him, "Adam, I want you to name every living thing on the face of the earth, the fowl and the fish and all of that. Give them names." And so Adam set out and he began to study and to become aware of the nature of each individual creature. And so when he saw this thing crawl out of the water and had long scaly tail and long teeth, he called it an alligator. And he began to know when it came out, oh, that's just Charlie the alligator. And when things flew at him, he would know that was a bird or a bat. And when he saw things on the mountain, he would call them according to what he felt was good. And he became familiar with each one of these creatures, these things that were once a part of his life as fear. And as you meet the woman who's had an abortion, who sees her presenting problems, who sees her life flying around about her, who does not understand why her life is always in a mode of change and confusion and frustration, and you begin to educate her and give her names to call things, she will begin to label these creatures, and she'll begin to feel like there's hope. And so I remember being on the telephone, this time not to God, but to a woman named Renata Penny, and she said, "There's a name for what we have." And I said, "There's a name for what someone's actually named us?" And she said, "Yes, it's called post-abortion syndrome." And I remember feeling just a sense of relief. There was finally a label to my life. And as you begin to share with this woman labels and terms and processes, she can begin to put pieces of her life together, and her life's puzzle will begin to make sense to her. I'd like to challenge you to this thought, that every step, every night that you meet with your client, you will spend time educating her, presenting her with ideas and facts and findings, and she will begin to absorb this either through material or through your words. Some of those things would include, let me just kind of role play with you. Mary, over the next few weeks, as we talk about your abortion, you're going to see that abortion is very traumatizing, that it is painful, that it has sights and smells and sounds. And maybe you're going to remember some of this. Quite often as we go through denial, we deny all of those senses. You see, just because a woman's gone through an abortion, that doesn't mean that she automatically knows that it's painful and that it hurt her. But once you begin to give her those labels, she'll say, "Yeah, you know, my abortion was. It was really painful. And she began to accept that part of reality. You'll need to share with her things that are going to happen with her as you go through the program. Let her know that she's going to begin experience emotional feelings, anger. She's going to experience grief. She's going to experience a lot of pain that she has been denying. She may begin to dream, daydream or night dream, of the unborn child, of babies, of the abortion, whatever her situation may be. That she's going to begin feeling exhausted after each session. And that's good. You want her to come to counseling and to relinquish a lot of that pain and locked up anger. You may also point out to her the different goals that you're going to be covering. Quite often I will let her know that we will be relinquishing through the experience of grief and what that is. Many women do not understand that grief is, or mourning is different than crying. And when we cover that in the next segment, you will begin to learn the difference between crying and grief. You will share with her about the relationship with her child, about relationships with her family, and certainly spiritual relationships. You'll need to define for her denial, what it is, how it becomes dysfunctional. You're going to have to define for her post-abortion syndrome and also the different dysfunctions that come with that. And also you will need to educate her on any type of referrals that she will need. If a woman comes to you and she is maybe addicted to drugs or having problems with alcohol, you'll need to refer her to a place that can help her with that, maybe a 12-step program. So all of this education begins with each step and also begins on the telephone when she calls you. I'd like to now go into abortion connectors. If you like, you can follow me in your training manual on page 10. Abortion connectors, as I define it, is something that is happening today, right now, with a woman that she either sees or a conversation that she's experiencing that subconsciously reminds her of a pain once called abortion. And then it causes a very intense emotional reaction. For example, when they began to see re-experience in women, they would quite often note that even up to 10, 15 years later after an abortion, if a woman walked into a doctor's office and she had a physical examination, she took off her clothes, she laid on her back, put her legs up, and began to have a pelvic examination, she would break out into sweating, become nauseous, and have an emotional, either depression or anger, an emotional experience. And I began to see this not only with major events, that would be an obvious event, but in little things in my clients' lives as well as in my own life. And I began to see that each woman has her own unique connectors. And these connectors, these reminders or re-experiences, can be something that we would call very little or just minute, to pet peeves, little picky things about the woman, or they can be, again, obvious. I'd like to cover just exactly how we find these connectors. There are 3 areas on page 10 that we will be looking for as we counsel and we intake information from our client. The first, item that you're going to look for connectors, a possible connector, are patterns. These are events or people that seem to keep appearing or coming about as the client shares her story. Now, let me give you an example. A client may begin her story by saying, well, I went to the doctor's office and I remember they handed me this form to fill out. And she'll describe that. Maybe an hour or so later, she'll mention something about, well, I filled out this questionnaire. When I went to the welfare department, they gave me more material and more forms to fill out. And every time as you meet with the client, you notice that there's these forms or questionnaires. That could possibly then be a connector. Another thing to listen for are peculiar details. These are things that you would say as a counselor, gee, if I had an abortion 10 years ago, would I remember that? Let me give you some examples. She may say, I'll never forget, the doctor, he had this wart right here on the end of his nose. Now, if you had had an abortion, that's probably not something you would remember. So that could be a peculiar detail. Everything in the office was blue. Blue flowers, blue dresses, blue gowns, blue tables, blue blankets. I'll never forget, as I walked into the abortion clinic, there was a gumball machine right there. And I thought, what is a gumball machine doing in a clinic? Peculiar details. Here's one that's quite common. I'll never forget how narrow and tiny the hallway was as I walked into the room. So peculiar details. The third element that can lead into connectors is as your client is talking, she'll begin to describe very emotional scene, a very emotional, exaggerated type of scene. You'll have to look for expressions such as in her face or maybe in her hands. She'll begin to say, and then, you know, as I told my mother, she began yelling at me, and you'll be able to sense and to see that this is a very emotional situation for this client. She may be crying. She may not make the sounds of crying, but you can look into her face and see the tears. The suction machine was turned off, and in a few seconds, everyone left the room, and I was there, all alone, and I was so isolated. And so you may begin to sense that this is a very painful situation that your client is still feeling. Now, what you'll do once you begin to listen to these three different items, you'll make a note in your intake sheets with a C for connectors. And you can either underline the gumball machine or the wart on the doctor's nose, whatever particular connector you think that the client could possibly have. You will go back into your intake sheets after 7 hours of working with your client in step 7, and this is all explained well in the manual, and you will take those connectors out and you will put them into today's world or today's activity. For an example, if a client says to you, I'll never forget, I heard the clanging of the instruments and the dilators as the doctor threw them on the table, then perhaps silverware or kitchen items. I'll never forget the sound of the vacuum and the pulling and the tugging as the abortion procedure went on. Today, this client goes back and she vacuums her carpet, and she can't understand why she screams and yells at the kids for the rest of the day. So you would explain to her, as you pick up the connectors, maybe vacuuming could be today's experience that reminds you of a pain once called abortion. So those are the connectors, and you will have to be able to use your imagination. You have to be creative. Let me give you another sample to give you a feel for this. I had a client say actually a few clients say to me, as I looked over and saw the jar full of blood, I knew that my baby was in there. So you would say blood would possibly be a connector, the jar. To pull that into today's, it could be a mayonnaise jar, other glass jars, maybe lamps, the color red, bleeding, watching surgery, you know, all the different activities that you can think of that would surround today. Don't be limited. Give her as many possible connectors as you can possibly come up with. And also, again, you will educate your client what connectors are and how to find them. And as you begin to teach her this process, she will start putting things together for her own, in her own life. And once she learns the process, she'll say, you know what, I thought of another connector. And as you give her this sheet of possible connectors, she will then fill it out and say, yes, this is something that does really bother me. Or she'll say, no, this really doesn't affect me. And she herself will know what is a connector and what isn't. But it's good for you to offer her as many possible connectors so that you don't miss any. And as she goes on with each year and each month, she will begin to connect things in her life that upset her. And I'm still finding things today, and I've been working on recovery for 7.5 years. So just list as many possible connectors, and there is a workup sheet, and in your intake packet in the back of the manual, all of that material is supplied to make it easier for you. Thank you. Welcome to segment 4. We'll be discussing goal number 2. It's titled Relinquishing Suppressed Emotional Pain and Anger. Before a woman can release her pain or her loss, her grief, and her anger and resentment, 4 things need to happen. The first is she needs to break the denial that it is there and accept the reality that it is there within her. And you as a counselor must accept this as well. In other words, if a client walks in and says, yes, I went to a rock concert and I had some oil placed on my head and now I'm all through hurting from my abortion, she probably is in a state of denial. You could begin by asking her, what anger were you freed from? Or how did you come about relinquishing the suppressed pain? Just because a client can deny it doesn't mean that it's not there. So we need to break through that denial. We as a counselor know it is there and help her to express it. The second thing that needs to happen is she needs to verbally identify it. As she is beginning her grief or her mourning, she would say, and it hurts so bad, or I miss my baby, or the pain of the abortion caused something. She would be expressing and verbally identifying her grief. Also, the same goes for anger. I'm angry at my mother because she forced me to have the abortion. She was non-supportive. She wouldn't face my father. I'm angry at Jim because he pressured me to have the abortion. I'm angry at the abortion providers because they didn't give me all the information. She will need to verbally identify it. Thirdly, she needs to be willing to let this happen. If a client does it in her mind and yet holds it in, then it's not going to do any good. You're not going to see a client come through therapy successfully. She needs to be, number 4, in a supportive environment and feel very safe. If you come across as judgmental or maybe there's an attitude of distancing, you're not real warm to your client, you haven't built that rapport, she may feel uncomfortable with identifying and verbalizing her pain and anger. With those 4 things in mind, let's talk about going to grief and mourning. And you can follow along with me in your training manual as we turn to page 39 and 40. And I'd like for you to first know that there is a difference between crying and mourning, particularly when it comes to loss. And we'll define loss in a few minutes. But again, you'll need to educate and tell your client this. This is crying. But grief is totally different. You will hear sounds that will come from a woman's inward soul, from the bottom of her, and come out. It will be sounds of wailing. It will be sounds like a baby crying. It will be tones that are not just expressive in her face, but with her body. She'll be bent over. She'll be in pain, maybe back pain, abdominal pain, cramping. You will see her body shake. She may sweat. There can be no sound at all, perhaps just a silence as she begins to go through grief. And as you explain this to your client, you'll tell her that that is a good thing. That is her body relinquishing all of this loss and pain that she's kept inside of her. And that through that releasing, she'll find joy and contentment. And not to stop it if she's alone. Quite often a woman will enter grief as she begins to talk and really think about the abortion procedure and her feelings at that time. And that's in step 4. Another step that grief may come is in step 8 as she talks about the relationship with the child and begins to sense the loss and the closure process. Now, I'd like to turn to page 39 and 40 as we talk about the women who do not necessarily grieve or enter a grieving process. I have down there 3 areas in which that may occur. The first client has gone through a trauma, perhaps the death of a parent, perhaps the death of a close friend, or maybe even has lost an animal that she's had for 16 years. And as she grieved over that parent, she also relinquished the pain from her abortion. So that may be a client that you're counseling and you say, we went through the steps, but my client didn't experience a grieving process. Maybe it's because she already went through it. Another type of client that you may come across that does not necessarily visually show you that she's grieving is a client who is avoiding that part. She's retreating back when she comes to feeling her body needing to release that pain. And this client, I have found quite often, will talk a lot and become distracted as a way to avoid dealing with that pain. And she may talk a lot about what happened today, or she may talk a lot about a friend or somebody else, but she won't talk about her pain. So you may want to just ask her, are you trying to avoid the pain and the loss from the abortion? You know, every time we come to step 4, you began talking about, you know, Mary or Joe or what happened today. And just very gently ask her, is this too painful for you to deal with yet? As a rule of thumb, you should never intrude or try to force a client to grieve. There are some therapists who will make women sit down and watch films on aborted children or watch pro-life films in order to force them to grieve. There are other therapists I've heard who give women babies and baby dolls, and they'll hold the doll and they'll begin to bond to it, and then the counselor will take the doll away from them. I'm not real sure that I agree with that, and I would never certainly use that in my own therapy. I don't think we should force people into grief. I believe it comes sometimes through prayer and on their own. It doesn't always come with us in the counseling room. And I believe that we should respect our client's privacy enough that as you work with a client, particularly in step 4, as you're dealing with the abortion, just say with her, you know, tonight probably would be a good night just to get by yourself and pray. And as you begin to think about the abortion procedures, see if, you know, through your prayer, if grief does come and mourning and wailing are something that you can use, avenues to use to relinquish this loss. I'd like to go ahead for time purposes and share with you the concept of loss. The grieving process may, or the recovery from the grieving process may take a few months, may take a couple of years, depending on your client, how old she is, and what she has already processed. If we've learned one thing in abortion recovery in the few years that we've been dealing with it, is that this is a layering process. It's a peeling away of one layer at a time. This layer is called reality. I can peel away this much of reality, and it's so raw and it's so fresh and it's so painful that I have to just deal right now with this much loss and this much pain. And next year I'll be able to peel back the second layer or the third. And so if you have a client that's a young woman, maybe her loss is that during her abortion process she missed the prom. And so she's going to grieve as a young person over missing the prom and not being able to buy a pretty dress, or the pretty dress that she bought she was unable to wear. And as this client gets older and she becomes a single person, she may realize another loss. As she becomes married, she'll realize that she's not as functional as a wife. And as she has her own children, she may grieve the loss as a good parent. And so on as this person gets older and realizes these different losses and how abortion has entwined itself around her life, the grieving process may occur over these particular losses. So be aware of that. Another area in losses is there can be contributing losses other than the loss of the child. So as you're intaking information, be aware of that maybe this boyfriend meant everything to this client, or this husband, this relationship meant everything to this client. And after the abortion, they broke up. That relationship would be a loss. Maybe they lost their job or school, something else very important to them. So be aware of the fact that all of these losses come into play as you think about relinquishing pain. You can turn in your manuals to page 5 and 6. I'd like to visualize in your mind what your goal is as far as putting off anger with your client. I want you to picture you're standing at a pier and there's a boat in the water below you. What we want to do is have the client put her hands on this boat, the anger in her life, and to be able just to push it off away from her, a casting off. And that sounds very easy and simple to do. But I have found that in dealing with anger, both in my own life and in the lives of my client, was very difficult to overcome. And here's why, on page 56. There are two types, on page 6. There are two types of anger. And this seems to be an answer as to why anger is so deeply embedded. The first anger is the spiritual anger. That is, the righteous or godly anger that we know abortion is taking innocent life and is a mortal sin. The second type of anger is the self-emotional anger. See, many of us were personally violated in a variety of ways. You combine these angers and you'll hear things from your client such as, "Since my abortions, I hate myself, yet I'm so angry at those involved." I'd like to share with you the normal or typical response to people involved in past abortions, how they handle it and what they do when it comes to anger. The first thing that we all do is deny it. We say, "Oh, I've forgiven those people involved in my abortion." And this is very quick and it's not well thought out. And if you were to ask that client, "Oh, well, who were the people involved in your abortion?" she would probably not be able to name them for you or even name the specific reasons why she was angry with them. The second thing is that we keep our anger, we impact it. And you hear things, "I hurt so bad since my abortion. I'm guilty and I hate everyone involved." And then comes the revenge. "I hope the doctor who performed my abortion chokes on his lobster." And lastly, spiritual separation. "How could God ever forgive me or listen to my prayers?" This is the wrong response to anger. So what you're going to do is educate your client in the wrong response, what she's doing now, and then you're going to educate her in the proper response. There are 4 goals in dealing with spiritual anger and emotional anger. The first goal in both of these, putting off spiritual and emotional anger, is to accept that the anger is in existence. Secondly, you want to have your client verbally identify those feelings. The feelings of anger and why they're there, or who they're angry with and why they're angry with them. The third, in spiritual anger, you're going to have your client expel her anger through continuous pro-life activity. And with the emotional anger, you're going to have your client express her anger in a therapeutic way in the counseling room. And fourth goal in both of these angers is to put their trust in God, in His truth, and His Word. And we'll get into the details of these goals now. Let's deal with emotional anger, turn to page 12. And putting off anger here in the emotional anger, we want to be able to help the client identify who she's angry with. And we want to be able to say to her, here's not only who you're angry with, but why you're angry with them. So on bottom of page 12, you'll see that in your intake, you're going to look for who the individuals are and why your client is angry with them. Now, an example of this may be that your client says something like, I can't believe I let George talk me into having the abortion. So George would become what I call a villain, a person in this client's story who is a participant in the abortion. The reason that George is a villain, or the reasons why we're angry with him, is because he talked us into having the abortion. So this is a way to help your client identify. Very quickly turn to page 44 in your manual. And I want to give you some examples of statements that you would be able to tell that your client has accepted her anger and she is identifying her anger. She's able to identify it spiritually and emotionally. You know, you can tell when a client has accepted her anger because she has identified it by this example. If I walked up to you and said, I just hit the red Ford in the parking lot, and I knew that you own the red Ford, you would probably go, oh yeah, right. But when I took you out to the parking lot and you saw your car and you pointed and said, you hit my car, I would know that you had accepted it because you had just identified it. That's what we want to do with your client. We want to hear her identify it so we know she's accepted the anger's there. For spiritual and righteous anger, you're going to hear your client say things, I'm angry at myself for using the abortion to cover up my sinful lifestyle. I'm angry at my loneliness because I knew I was covering up my sin and did not share my crisis because of my shame. I'm angry at the scars the abortion has made on my spiritual walk, and now I have separated myself from God. I'm angry with the death and loss of my child, knowing it was the result of hardened hearts towards God. You see, the biblical example that we give for spiritual anger is found in Mark chapter 3, verses 3 and 5. It says, Jesus was angry and he grieved at the Pharisees because of their hardened hearts, resulting in the rejection of goodness and of God. And this is the client as she thinks in terms of her spiritual anger. Now let's go to spiritual anger. To accept it and identify, you're going to hear things like this. I'm angry at Jim. Why? For using me for sex and agreeing to the abortion. I'm angry at the loneliness I felt after the abortion due to the lack of support. You see, it's a personal violation. I'm angry at having to live the rest of my life knowing what I've done and with the emotional scars. I'm angry because I will never hold my baby or raise it here on earth, even though it was my baby. These are personal, emotional samples. A biblical example of self-emotional anger is found in Genesis chapter 34, where Jacob's family was distressed and grieved over Dinah's rape, since it was a disgrace to the family. They were personally violated. And so now that we've got our client accepting and verbally identifying her anger, we're going to put her in to getting rid of it, to putting it off. This is where spiritual anger and emotional anger separate. What we're going to do emotionally with the emotional anger is to use good therapy in the counseling room. As we've given the client her villains and her specific reasons why she's angry at those people, we're going to say, Mary, now I want you to go home and I want you to write a letter. We're not going to give this letter to these people, but I want you to write a letter and express your feelings of anger as we write Jim or Susie or your mom. And I want you to bring those letters back to me next week, and I'm going to have you read them to me, and then we're going to place them in your file. And this helps to relinquish all of this bottled up, impacted anger and resentment that your client has within her. In fact, you'll find that when she comes back into the room and she begins to read these letters that she's written, she'll say, gee, I never realized how angry I was about all this. But writing really helped me to see that, and I feel much better now expressing it. It's kind of like you've had a bad day, and your husband walks through the door, and you say, I've had a horrible day. The baby has flushed down the cleanser in the toilet, the washing machine overflooded, the delivery man did not deliver the clothes that I had, waited for. It's just been a horrible day. And you need to explode and express. And so your husband says to you, well, exactly how did that happen, that the baby flushed the cleanser down the toilet? And you explain all that. And as you explain it, you let out a lot of this frustration. Well, as your client comes into the counseling room and she's reading and she has written all of this, she's allowed to express it. And this releases a lot of this from her. Then what we'll do is move her into phase 4. So you can go ahead. And by the way, phase 4 is taken care of a second session. Phases 1 through 3 are taken care of in a first section in the anger process. Phase 4 is on page 49 in your intake packet. And after your client has read these letters of expressing her anger to these individuals, you would then share with her how God can bring about a peace with this emotional anger. And on page 49, you'll see that in the bottom box, there are 6 different scriptures that talk about God being all knowing, about Him holding the scales of balance in His life, of Him being just and the Almighty Judge. And as you begin to read these scriptures, you can tell her, Mary, you only know this much about the man who performed the abortion, the man who took the life of your child. But God knows everything about him. He knows his bank account, He knows his family, He knows what car he drives. And it says that God is the ruler over all, that He can stand on your behalf as the one who was oppressed and be the judge and balance things out. Balance all of these violations that occur to you personally. And He can make the wrong right. So we're going to spend a little time in prayer, knowing who God is and knowing that we can trust Him to make a proper judgment on your behalf, the one who was oppressed. And as you begin to pray with her, you can just take those letters that she's written and just ask her to picture in her mind's eye God in her prayer and these individuals coming to Him one by one. And as she shares what is written in these letters, that she can see, not necessarily hear, but just see that God is going to deal with this individual, such as the abortionist. That the abortionist is in the throne room of God, and God is dealing with him, and God will take care of her needs and balance out the judgment on her behalf. After you close in prayer, then you will move into emotional anger. So go back in your training manuals as we deal with emotional anger and putting it off, onto page 46. I believe that the way sin damages an individual, that it motivates them when they repent of that sin to go out and tell others to repent or to change or not to even get involved in that particular sin. For example, we look at the life of Chuck Colson. He became a Christian in prison, and his whole life now is dedicated to people who are in prison. We look at people who are running alcohol programs, and God touches their life as a person who drank and had a problem in drinking. God touches their life, and then they want to go out and help other people who have problems in alcohol. People who are rehabilitated from drugs. When God touches their life, they go back to who? The teenagers, or back to other people who are involved with drugs. And so is the post-aborted woman. As she comes out of this area of being involved in abortion and she enters abortion recovery, God touches her life and she wants to get involved in the pro-life movement. And I believe this is a way to continually begin to get rid of her spiritual anger. Now, a biblical example of this is found in the book of Jonah. Jonah knew that Nineveh was a sinful nation, and he was angry about that. In fact, he told God, go out and curse that city. In fact, he just wanted God to destroy all of the people in the city. He was so angry at them for what they had done to the Jewish nation. And God had a different plan for Jonah. He said, Jonah, you're filled with a lot of anger. I want you to go and proclaim the truth to Nineveh. Well, Jonah got sidetracked, but eventually he ended up in Nineveh. And he began to walk around the city proclaiming the truth that people needed to repent, to stop doing what they were doing. And as Jonah proclaimed the truth, he dumped out his anger. In fact, to the point where he was totally exhausted. And God was able to deal with Nineveh. And so we want the post-aborted woman to proclaim the truth through working through the pro-life movement. She's able to exhaust herself and to allow God to judge the people who are involved in abortion. So, for example, your client may, as part of her pro-life work, want to work in an alternative center to counsel women pre-decision. She may want to work in chastity. She may want to be a sidewalk counselor. She may want to be a rescuer. She may want to work in abortion recovery. Whatever her particular area is, whether it's writing letters or working up at the Capitol, she will choose an area in which she can continually proclaim the truth that abortion does take the life of a child and damage men and women. And as she begins to work in the pro-life movement, her recovery process will begin to really take hold, and she'll begin to feel whole, and she'll begin to see that something that was very negative and violent against her can be used to help other people, and that will begin to also build her esteem. Now, to give a flavor for this, what I will do for therapy is have her go home and write a letters to the editor. And she can either describe her own personal testimony in this letter, or she can talk about the alternative center that's right down the street rather than having an abortion. She can talk about a particular piece of legislation, whatever she wants her letter to be. Some women have actually mailed these into the newspapers. Others, most of them, we just place them in their file. But they began to see how they can proclaim the truth and began to feel like they're taking this sin, this violation, and letting God use it for good, for repentance. Then, again, turning back to page 49, you can see the box there, that we also allow God's justice and judgment to be trusted, even in spiritual anger. And with that, Jonah, again back in the city of Nineveh, saw that God chose for repentance. One of the first things that I learned in abortion recovery, as I began to make appointments with doctors who perform abortions and to share with them my anger towards them, that God didn't necessarily blow up the clinics that I visited, and God didn't kill the people that I said quit doing abortions, and they didn't. They kept doing them. But I learned that through proclaiming the truth, I could trust God and let God deal with those individuals, even the men who were still performing abortions, that God would deal with them and judge them, and I trusted Him. And I feel that the client needs to move into that mode, that if she goes to a clinic and she sidewalk counsels, or she talks with maybe some of the feminists or the clinic workers, that she can just walk away from that clinic in peace, knowing that God will use her truth to deal with that individual's hearts. And we're seeing many abortion providers turn around because post-aborted women took the time to get rid of their spiritual anger and proclaim the truth. Thank you. Welcome to the segment on forgiveness and restoration to relationships, man to God and man to man. Now, if you're watching this, you may be on segment 5 or 6. We're not sure. We're filming this in Toronto, Canada. It's midnight, and we're a little tired. So however the real man cuts this will determine if you're on segment 5 or 6. But we are dealing on forgiveness. And the proper time, I feel, as a counselor, to deal with forgiveness is when anger has been thoroughly and properly worked through. As a client really releases her anger and her frustration and resentment, you will actually even see her body begin to relax. And she will move right into the phase of forgiveness. Something you can listen for to see if you dealt with all of the anger is a client will say something to you such as, I can forgive other people, but I kind of have a feeling that God can't forgive me because I participated in abortion. What she's disclosing is that if God has a list of people he can forgive for certain sins and a list of sins that he can't forgive, then that allows her, your client, to have a list of people involved that she forgives and her little secret list of people she has a hard time forgiving. So that may be a clue to listen in for. And you would have to go back and work through anger or just even present the idea to her. But as we begin to work in the area of forgiveness, I like to deal with concepts, biblical concepts, by role play. I'm going to begin this segment by sharing with you the actual list of concepts, and then I will role play for you in order to give you a nice picturist verbal conversation to give to your client that she will really understand and grasp and move into the area of forgiveness. Also in this step, you will be giving her a client handout where she can work through the Bible. It's just a short handout of God forgiving her and she forgiving others. And so we'll mention that. The first concept is forgiving is not necessarily forgetting. That only God can do that. That forgiveness is not denial. It's not quickly saying, I'm not angry at anyone. That it is not a overlooking. Forgiving is hard because the person who was offended has to be the one who forgives. Forgiveness will not take away the pain, but it will open the valve to begin releasing the pain. That time and God will help make forgiveness take hold. Forgiving helps to free the forgiver. Forgiving is realizing that you are no better than the person that you are forgiving. And forgiveness is a decision. It is not done as a show or an act that will benefit me, your counselor. All right, those are the concepts. Now let's put them in a role play form. The first one. Mary, when you came in tonight, you quickly just took off your coat, whipped it around, and as you were standing in the entryway, your coat, as it flipped off, hit a vase, a favorite heirloom of mine. And as it rocked back and forth off of the chest and fell onto the floor, I'll never forget how it just fell into pieces all over the floor. And how you were just, oh, sorry, so flippant about it. You didn't seem to have any attitude of remorse or even said that you were really sorry and helped me clean it up. And as you left that night, I remember getting the dustpan and the broom and sweeping this favorite heirloom, and it had been in our family, and looking at it shattered and going over in my mind how your attitude was so careless, you weren't paying attention. And in fact, after I cleaned it up the next day, I went down and I looked at the spot where this vase had been, and all of it just went in my mind over and over. Even a week later, as I walked past that particular part in the entryway, I would think about this horrible scene and your attitude and your coat and the pieces and throwing it out. And I just remained angry about it. Meanwhile, you're out driving in your car. You've even forgotten that you even broke my family heirloom. But staying angry at you and going over this in my mind is only destroying me. It's only paining me. And as I make a commitment to forgive you and to say, well, when I walk by this spot in the hallway, I'm going to make a decision to just not be angry anymore, to think, it's over with, it's done. In fact, I'm even going to go out and buy something to replace this particular heirloom, something that I like. And forgiveness is just like that. See, I was the one who was offended, yet I am required to forgive you. I could not be free from the pain and the anger even though you were driving around. I am required to forgive you. And as I forgive you and decide not to think on that painful day and moment and remembering all of the broken pieces, then I become free. And so you must forgive those people who participated in your abortion, even the doctor. As you forgive those people, you become free. See, the abortionist, he's driving around in his car. He doesn't even know your name. And yet you remain angry by going over and over this in your mind. I want to be able to replace this with something good, perhaps even something beautiful. And as you become involved in the pro-life movement, you can replace this painful thing with something beautiful as you see other people turn from abortion and make a decision to continue their pregnancy, or as you help other women to recover from abortion. Here's another role play that I like to use. Mary, can you ever tell me if there was a time that you either twisted your ankle or you broke a limb? You look like a pretty active young woman. Yeah, I remember a time, Mary says, when I was playing volleyball, and as I went up for the spike, I rolled my ankle. Really, what ankle was it? It was my right ankle, and when I came down, it hurt really bad. I knew I had damaged it. How long ago was it? Oh, it was about 10 years ago. Well, what happened? Well, I went to the doctor and they took x-rays and they began to, see that they were going to have to, it wasn't a break, but they were going to have to bandage it. And tell me, did your leg turn blue or did it hurt for a while? Yeah, in fact, the blue and black ran all the way up my leg, and I had crutches. I walked for a couple of days, and then finally, eventually, that bandage, we could take that off, and I could do away with the crutches, and it gradually healed up. Well, how does it work for you now? You seem to walk in here okay. Yeah, it's fine. It doesn't hurt anymore. I still play volleyball once in a while, and it's great. Well, healing and forgiveness go hand in hand. You see, what time did and it allowed your leg to do, time will do the same thing for healing the area of, or the painful spot that abortion has left on you. As you make a decision to forgive these people involved in your abortion and to receive the forgiveness that God has given to you, time will be the thing that allows you to heal. Just like your ankle wasn't healed the next day, you still saw the bruises. Also, even though your ankle was wounded 10 years ago, you still remember the details to this day. And so 10 years from now, you'll remember the details of your abortion, but you will not feel the pain because your decision in time of forgiveness will allow that pain to begin being released. Also, you went to a medical person, a physician, and they helped you wrap up your ankle. And as you come to God for forgiveness, not only receiving forgiveness for yourself, but asking Him to help you forgive other people, that will be the wrap around your wounds from abortion. As you make a decision to forgive people, make a commitment, that will be the bandage that keeps your healing process together. I'd like to just challenge you with these role plays in order to give your client a full picture in her mind that these concepts can be grasped, can take hold. One final role play, which is found on page 53, it's step 7, as you enter forgiveness phase, is actually taken from the Bible. Before I give you that, I want to remind you that your client you will give her these 2 role plays, the family heirloom and the healing process, as you close off phase 6, the anger process. And you will hand her at that time a handout on forgiveness. And she will, in this handout, spend about 5 to 10 minutes on God's forgiveness to her, and another 5 to 10 minutes on her forgiveness to others. And then at the bottom of that handout, it will say, take each of your villains and write them now a letter of forgiveness for specific reasons. So she'll then take her letter, the same people that she wrote letters to that she was angry with, and now she'll say, "Dear Mom, I forgive you for pushing me into the abortion. I realize that you were trying to help me at the time." And she'll begin to write these letters. She'll come back the next week, and you'll look over her exercise, ask her if she understood the biblical concepts of God forgiving her, her forgiving others, and to now read to you the letters that she's written to her villains. And she'll read these letters. Then I go into the final role play, which is this. Luke chapter 7, and it's kind of a lengthy portion. It's verses 36 through 50, and that's all written in your manual. And it's quickly the passage where Jesus goes to the house of Simon. And they're all in the Pharisee's house. And a woman comes in who's known to be a very sinful woman. And she begins to sit at the feet of Jesus. And I'm sure you're familiar with this story. And as she begins to weep and to wipe the feet of Jesus, Simon kind of gets haughty and he thinks, you know, if Jesus really knew who this woman was, he wouldn't let her be sitting here, particularly at his feet, some prophet he is. And Jesus, knowing the thoughts of Simon, said, "Simon, I have something to ask you. There were two debtors," and he tells him the debtor story, one who owed quite a bit of money and one who owed a little. Both were declared free because they were unable to pay the debts. Which one of the debtors would be more appreciative and more kind and loving to the person who freed them? And Simon said, "Well, I suppose the one with the highest debt." And Jesus said, "You have rightly answered." And then he looked at the woman at his feet, and he said to Simon, "I entered your house, and you did not kiss me. Yet this woman has continued to kiss my feet. I entered your house, and you gave me no water. And yet this woman washes my feet with her tears. Therefore I say to you that those people who are forgiven of much love much." And he looked at the woman and he said, "Your sins are no more." And as we look at this story and we read this to our client, we will challenge her with the thought or the choice that she can either be as Simon, the Pharisee, who points to the people in her story, in her abortion decision, and says, "God, look at what those people did to me. Look at the abortionist who took the life of my child." And she'll reap what Simon reaped, not being able to be close and loving to God, not being able to see himself as a sinner, but pointing to others. Or she can choose to be the woman at the feet of Jesus, realizing that she herself is no better than the people involved in her story, and to come to God with a totally repentant attitude, in that she can freely forgive other people because she herself is freely forgiven. And so I'll ask the client, after reading that particular story, which one would you rather be? Would you rather be the Pharisee, or would you rather be at the feet of Jesus? And all of my clients have said, I'd rather be at the feet of Jesus. And so then, as you turn over to page 54, we'll enter another time of prayer. And again, we just ask her to picture in her mind's eye as we pray these individuals who are in her story, and tell God that she is forgiven them, that she is making a commitment to move on with her life and to overlook their participation in her abortion, to help her remember this commitment, and to then move on. And I will also end that session with letting the client pray and close in prayer. And also, if for additional help, on the bottom of page 54 and in your intake packet, you'll notice a contract on forgiveness. This is simply a visual aid in which I sign a piece of paper as a witness with her signature saying, "Today is the day that we made a commitment to begin forgiveness and restoration to our relationships." At the end of the 9th chapter, you'll notice that there's a section on restoring our today's relationship. And I don't have time in the tape to cover the details of that. But in step 9, you'll be able to see that I have broken down the relationships into 3 categories. The first one is the intimate, her relationship with her husband, how to restore that, her parents, and also her children, and then the outer circle, her friends. And with that, there's some practical tips and helps on how to put together a marriage. And something that should be noted, and is in the book in bold print, that if you're working with a couple who together, they're now married, aborted a child, you're dealing with severe problems in a marriage. And always recommend that that couple goes to a professional therapist, and at least for 6 months, to work out some of the problems that occur during a marriage. Sometimes you may need to do that if only one family member has been aborted. But if they marry, you'll see an intense exaggeration of presenting problems. So I appreciate your consistent effort in staying with us in these tapes. I know it's difficult, but we have a couple more segments to go before we complete our recovery training.